Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Soumajit Patro. I am an associate professor of sociology. I teach in Sidhu Kanu Birsa University, Purulia. It is in West Bengal. In this module, I'll discuss tribal movements in India. I should start with the very definition of tribe. Tribe is a group of people, band, occupying a territory or territories, having a feeling of unity among them, and this feeling of unity is derived from numerous similarities in a culture, language, ethnicities, and frequent contacts and a certain community of interest. Apart from that, every tribal social movement are stand for the protection of their habitat, land, their culture, solidarity, and natural resources. Obviously, some tribal movements are caused by the problem of identity crisis of the tribal people. There are some components of social movements. First, these are objectives of social movements. In any social movement, you will find there are some objectives, goals of the protesters who start social movement. Secondly, there should be some kind of ideology. These ideologies acts as a cementing force to bind the people who stand for the cause of the social movement and join their hands. Thirdly, there have some programs, some schemes through which the anger is vented out. There are leadership and organization. These 5 factors, objectives, ideology, programs, leadership, and organization, are the features, very important features of any social movement. Now, the major reasons of tribal movement. I will discuss the major reasons of tribal movement. For example, Santal movement, Kol movement, Munda movement, they all started against the permanent land settlement rule of the British government. Say for example, Tana Bhagat movement. Why did it happen? It happened against the Sanskritization initiatives. For example, Dongaria Kond movement, Kol movement, Mijos movement, all these movements started to restore their rights over the natural resources. All these movements are caused by, all these movements were originated out of these causes, whether it is permanent land settlement, rule of the British government, or Sanskritization, or to ensure their right to restore their right over the natural resources. For example, there are Bhil insurgents or Maurya rebellion. These movements were started to restore the cultural identities of the tribal people, particularly the Bhil movement and Maurya movement. For example, in our country, there are many social movements of the tribal people who is demanded their political autonomy, their separate statehood. For example, Jharkhand movement, Naga movement, all these movements started to ensure the political autonomy of the tribal people. Now, the history of tribal movement of our country can be divided into four phases. Four phases. First phase, 1768 to 1860. This was against the local landlords and British Empire. This was the first phase of the tribal movement of our country. The second phase started from 1860 to 1920. 1860 to 1920, this was the second phase of the tribal movement, which covered a period of colonialism during which the capital, merchant capital, penetrated into the tribal areas, tribal economy, and it affected their relationship with traditional relationship, age-old relationship of the tribal people with the land and forest. You all know that tribal peoples are mainly live in jungle areas. There is a very intricate relationship, very intimate relationship also between the tribal people and the forest. So the movement, which we call the movement of second phase, we started in 1860 to 1920. During this period, many tribal movements of our country took place to protest against the disturbance, the destabilization of traditional tribal economy. The third phase started from 1920 to 1947. These tribal movements were mainly caused by the ill treatment of the tribals by the British rule. The tribal people, in large numbers, they joined in the freedom fight movement. The fourth phase is post-independent period, post-independence phase. It started from 1947 and it is continuing till today. Now, political autonomy, tribal lands, natural and traditional resources are the great reasons behind these kind of movements which started after independence. Now, we will discuss the categories of tribal movement. There are mainly three categories of tribal movement. One is reactionary movement. For example, Maurya rebellion. There are conservative movements. For example, Koi movement. Revolutionary movement. For example, Bhagat movement. Many of the tribal movements may also be classified as peasant movements. Many of the tribal movements are or can be classified as peasant movements. You know, many tribals today are peasants. So, when a cause arises which goes against against the interest of the tribal people, the tribal peasants, they start movement. Kathleen Goff in the year 1974 classified different peasant movements on the basis of their goals, ideologies, and methods of organization. You all know the name of Kathleen Goff. According to Kathleen Goff, there are 5 types of peasant revolts. One is Restorative Rebellion. To drive out the British and restore earlier rulers and social relations was the cause of these rebellions. Secondly, religious movements for the liberation of a religion or an ethnic group under a new form of government. Thirdly, social banditry Fourthly, terrorist vengeance with the idea of meting out collective injustice. You know, the tribal people always feel that they are deprived of the opportunities which the so-called quote unquote the people of mainstream population are enjoying. In our country, many states have been formed out of this feeling that the tribal people are marginalized, are being marginalized, are subject to exploitations. So many tribal movements have been started with this kind of feeling of collective injustice. Mass insurrections for the redress of particular grievances. These are also causes of tribal movements. There are some differences between tribal movement which occurred before independence and tribal movements which occurred after independence. I repeat that the aims, goals, and modes of protest varied widely between the movements which we can call pre-independence tribal movements and the movements which we can call the post-independent tribal movements. For example, before the independence, which tribal movement took place, were mostly separatist movements. Those movements which took place before independence, which we can call that pre-independence tribal movement, they were mostly separatist movement, but they also fought for the freedom and rights of the peasants. The path was violent. So mostly the tribal people's movement which occurred during the pre-independence period were mostly took the violent form. Now, most of the movements which were started after independence, they demanded mainly political autonomy. Particularly, they demanded a separate statehood. For example, you can say Jharkhand movement or Uttarakhand movement. All these movements were basically tribal movement. They started for the to ensure the political autonomy of the tribal people and their right to land and forest. So this is the feature of the post-independent tribal movement. So I repeat, if the pre-independent tribal movements are violent in nature, post-independent tribal movements are non-violent in nature mainly. Mainly they started, they loved, they liked, wanted to work out their grievances, to work out their demands from within the constitutional provisions. These cannot be treated outrightly as what we call secessionist movement. So these are mainly non-violent movement which took place in our country right after our independence. The non-violent path is based mainly on bargaining, on negotiations with the government using a variety of pressure tactics. Violent means are easier to reach a goal. Non-violent means are not so easy. So the tribal leaderships who lead those movements, they opted for bargaining and negotiating with the government, and they tried always to put pressure in various means by using various means without restoring to violence, without restoring to non-constitutional means. They tried to put enormous pressure on the government to ensure, to secure, to snatch their demand, to fulfill their demand. On the other hand, the violent path is militant. It is path of revolts or mass struggle based on developing the fighting power of the oppressed of the tribal people. So these are the differences between pre-independent tribal movement and post-independent tribal movements. In recent times, the transnational corporate companies are invited by the state to take control over the mineral-rich landmass in the tribal areas. This is very much problematic. Uncontrolled infiltration in the tribal domain, uncontrolled infiltration, unprecedented infiltration in the tribal domain that totally shatters the traditional tribal life in which the tribal people of our country are habituated to live for say thousands of years. This kind of unwanted, unprecedented, uncontrolled infiltration of the tribal people, of the outsiders, of the people from multinational companies who enter the tribal regions in search of the minerals, in search of many other things. These disturb the traditional tribal life. These multinational corporations, aided and abetted by the state machinery, without any commensurate work guild provided to the sons of the soil. The tribal people of our country are often termed as indigenous people, son of the soil, aboriginal people. Though today there are opposed views. However, in most of the literatures, you will find the tribal people are considered as the son of the soil, and these people have these kind of activities of the multinational companies, these kind of negligence on the part of indifference on the part of the government leads to marginalization of the tribal people, marginalization in their own lands, marginalization in their own territories. These kind of commercialization, I would call it commercialization of the tribal people's world, leads to further marginalization of the tribal people. These kind of things create a feeling of lack of empowerment and lack of effective governance, compounded with appalling poverty, has given rise to a violent tribal movement in India. It is also a major cause of the rise of the Maoist influence in the hilly regions. You can ask this question, that why in the among the deprived sections of our populations, why among the poorest of the poorer sections of the population, why Maoist movement are crystallized in these areas. This is one of the causes that these tribal people feel that they are being marginalized, they are being sidelined. In fact, sometimes they feel that they are elbowed out by the government, they are elbowed out by the so-called quote-unquote mainstream population. So this kind of insecurity leads to tribal movement in many parts of our country. So the tribal people who are basically, you can find these references in many literatures related to tribal life, that tribal people are simple, tribal people are very peaceful, tribal people are docile. All these all these tribal people who are simple, who are docile, who are a very innocent type, who do not want outsiders to spoil their own to spoil the harmony of their own life. They get irritated. They become furious. They become frustrated with the kind of things by which they are being treated, and the government machinery miserably often fails to find out a meaningful solutions. These force the tribal people to take up arms against their exploiters. The instances of tribal movement therefore remain a source of inspiration for all those who are exploited and marginalized. My students, to study tribal social movement, you have to know something about the tribal social organization. Without having a basic knowledge of the tribal life, you cannot understand the causes and consequences of tribal movement not only in our country, tribal movement of any part of this world. You have to know the tribal social life. The tribal people are very simple, honest, peace-loving people. They live mostly in what we call in the zones of less interactions. They live far away from the dins and bustles of our everyday life, from the chaos of our urban conglomerations. So these tribal people, they live, sometimes we call that in their own world. They created their own cultures, they created their own religions, they created their own language and their own world, and they lived there for thousands of years. Any kind of social movement, the tribal people do not start social movement out of their own. Any kind of social movement by the tribal people in this way or that has been caused by the intrusion of the outsiders in their own world. Sometimes they have been forced to leave the jungle. Sometimes in the history of our country, sometimes they have been uprooted from their own lands. Sometimes they have been forced to digest the culture of alien peoples whom they call diffuse aliens. So these intrusions, these kind of dismantling of the tribal people are the major causes. Whether these kind of intrusions, dismantling, destruction of the tribal world may be caused by the policy of the governments, maybe sometimes caused by the profit-making motives of the multinational companies, and sometimes maybe it can be crystallized, it can be crystallized rather by the issues which arise outside their own world. In this way or that, tribal social life, when gets disturbed, when tribal world is lost and they are not being accommodated in the new world, problems started. So these are the root of any tribal movement. If you want to understand the tribal movement, if you want to study tribal movement, you have to know something about the world of the tribal people in which they lived. They lived for thousands of years in faraway deserts, in hilly regions, in remote forests, what we call in the zones of less interaction. If you want to know more about this, please visit the website of EPG Pathshala. Thank you.